Grace, mercy, and the peace of our God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be with us this day. Amen. Today we look at the text from Exodus chapter 3, the call of Moses, with the thought that God chose you. Remember when we were kids? Depending on who you are, that's maybe a bit longer ago than for some others, which is fine. But when we're kids, out on the playground, there's games that are going to be played. I think this happens at every school, right? And somehow, two people are going to be the captains, the managers, the coaches, whatever they're called, and they're going to pick. So all the other kids line up, maybe against the fence or against the wall, and the two captains look at each other and think, "Oh, I'm going to get the good team." And then they start choosing. You remember that feeling standing against the wall wondering, am I going to get to play? Because at some point the teams are full and the other kids had to walk away. Or am I going to be picked last? If you've never got picked last, then find somebody who is here. Because most of us have probably been picked last at some point in our lives. But you are chosen. Even if you're picked last, you're on the team. And it's good to be on the team. Well, picking for teams on the playground when we're in elementary school and we're somewhere around this old isn't the only time that we've been chosen. If you've had a job, you were chosen. You were chosen for that job. If you had an interview and you sat down, you put on your good clothes, and you sat down across a table from someone who asked you questions about, who do you want to be in 2 to 5 years? And, all these typical questions, right? And you smiled and you were nervous and your stomach was like, but you tried not to show it. And you're kind of sweating, but, in the good clothes, it doesn't show as much maybe. And you're swallowing a lot. Try to get through the interview. And then you get an offer. That's a fantastic day. You were chosen. They picked you out of all the resumes that maybe they got or all the applications that they got for the job and all the people that they sat across the table from and asked all the same questions to. You stood out. You were chosen. And maybe it was a simple application for a, minimum wage job where you were going to flip burgers or whatever it was, but you were still chosen. You were still picked. You got to do the job. If you are now or have been in a relationship, you have been chosen. You picked. You chose, and someone chose you, especially if it's in, a marriage type relationship. You were chosen. And you made that choice. We've been chosen. And so today, as we look at Exodus chapter 3, we remember this, that we have been chosen and God calls. Here's the thing about God calling, though. And we see this in Exodus chapter 3. Moses wasn't looking for God. Moses wasn't standing up against the fence or the wall wondering, is God going to choose me among this group? God picked Moses out of a crowd of one, although God picked Moses out of a crowd of everyone who was living, specifically the people of Israel. But here's what Moses was doing. He was minding his own business. This is the beginning of chapter 3. Maybe it's familiar, but Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. He's tending sheep. Now note the context for Moses. He's not in the promised land. The land that was promised to his ancestor Abram, later Abraham. The land that the people had been in temporarily before they went to Egypt. When Joseph was in Egypt and became the number 2 guy and the whole thing happened with the famine. And so everybody moved down there. all of his brothers who had betrayed him and sold him into slavery and all that, that's the latter part of Genesis. That's not where he is. And he's not in Egypt where the people ended up and where the people were enslaved. He's not there either. He is in some random mountain. At least that's what it seems like. But it's a very special place where he ended up. Horeb, the mountain of God. Oh, interesting. Just randomly wandering, and Moses ends up in the right place at the right time, in the right circumstances. He's in Midian, though, married to Jethro's daughter, Jethro, the priest of Midian. Her name is Zipporah. And this is where he is. This is what Moses is doing. He's, just living his life at that point. And he seems content not to go to the mountain of God. He's not up there looking, except there's this strange sight. Something ever caught your eye that made you look? That second glance, wait. Maybe the person that you recognize or kind of remember, and who is that? And you try to place them and you wonder. Or maybe something that, you see it out of the corner of your eye, and when you look, it's not there. Have you had that happen before? Where it's like, wait, I thought I saw. That's weird. Moses saw something weird, right? Just a couple weeks ago, Drew and I were walking our dogs, and we're going up our street where we live, about 4 doors from our house, and he's walking one dog, and he's about maybe 20 yards behind me or something. And he said, "Dad, look at this spider." I've seen spiders before. What's the big deal about a spider? I've seen black widows. I've seen all kinds of spiders, whatever. Drew, is it big? We'd just come back from Arizona, and we saw some big spiders in Arizona, big furry spiders. And he said, "Yeah." And the dog found it first. Thankfully, Drew, being smart, pulled the dog away so that that playtime didn't last very long. And the spider wasn't all that interested. So I got back there and we looked, and sure enough, on our street where we live was a tarantula. A strange sight for our street. Kind of. Curious. When we get curious, we want to look. Moses looked. This is the end of verse 2 going into verse 3. "And behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned." Moses at that point is curious, but has no clue what is about to happen. He's just on a random mountain as far as he's concerned, and sees this strange thing, this bush that's burning but isn't consumed. And God called Moses from the burning bush. Verse 4, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses," and he said, "Here I am." Now, it just reads like he says, "Here I am." But I wonder, really, what was the tone of voice in that? "Here I am" might be more accurate. What is happening? Or was it, the voice of God in a way that brought him a peace and a contentment and where the presence of God just kind of washed over him, and he then wasn't nervous about why he's hearing a voice calling him by name from a bush that's burning and isn't consumed? Would you not be freaking out at that point? Heck with the sheep, I'm out of here, right? Jethro will forgive me when I tell him the truth. But Moses stayed. "Here I am." And note that he does call Moses by name, right? God knew what was going to happen, where Moses would be at that moment. For God, it's not an accident, and it's not a random place, and it's not a coincidence. I love that. It's kind of maybe cliche now, but first time I heard it, I thought that is the best. Coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. Have you heard that one? If not, write it down. You'll remember that. I think it's so great because this is true. This is not a coincidence. It's just It happened because God was there waiting for Moses, knowing he was going to show up that day. I don't think the bush was burning for 4 weeks while God was like, oh my goodness, what is he doing? No. God knew where he would be. He knew when he would be there, and he showed up and met him there on the mountain of God, not a random mountain at all. God speaks to us by his Spirit. He waits for us. He meets us where we are, and most of the time we're not looking either, right? We're going about our business. We're taking care of the things that we need to do. We've got the to-do list in the mind, and we're checking off the boxes. Whether we write it down or not, we're thinking about things that we need to get done today, right now. And we're doing those things. And sometimes God speaks to us in ways that are like startling. I've heard stories of people who've heard a voice audibly. I've never had that experience. But I've had times when I really felt like God was telling me somehow, maybe through another person, maybe through his word, as I'm reading it and it's just jumping off the page. There was a time when the words to Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 hit me on the side of the head like a brick. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding. It was like God was, right? Stop leaning on your own understanding. Sometimes God shows up and talks to us that way. Sometimes it's more of that still small voice, that feeling inside, that I know, I understand. And whatever God speaks to us, and it's different for each of us where we are. But ways can be mysterious as a burning bush. I heard a story from someone one time about driving along and just being kind of stuck in thoughts and, in your own head. Have you ever done that? Yes, we all have done that. And, not really paying attention, enough to be safe, right? But not really, there, like mentally in the moment. And looking up and in the dirt on the back of the semi-trailer, someone had written something. And it was like words that person really, really needed. And so from, not really here, not thinking about what's around, safely driving, not focused though on that truck, all of a sudden those words were right there. And it was like God had someone write those words for the person who would be driving behind that truck that moment. And sometimes I believe that's how God works. That God speaks to us in ways that are mysterious, that God does things for us that we don't understand, we don't anticipate. And he calls us by name. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine, the prophet Isaiah writes. And maybe we don't hear our names like Moses heard it from the bush, but God knows your name. He knows where you are and what you're doing and where you'll be and when. He knows. And God chose you, and he chose you for his reasons. Moses had a past. Earlier in the book of Exodus, in chapter 2, it describes why he went to Midian. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people. So Moses was among the people of Israel. He was born to Hebrew people in Egypt at a time when the Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt, and Pharaoh had said, all the male children, get rid of them. So Moses' mom and dad, for like 3 months, hid him in the house, and it got to the point where that was not going to work anymore. So they put him in a basket and floated him on the river. And Pharaoh's daughter found him and claimed him, took him home. Can I keep it? And she did. And she raised Moses. And so Moses is roughly 40 years old but he knows that he's Hebrew. I don't know how this worked. Moses had grown up. He went out to his people, and he looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. And he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Seeing no one, looking this way and that. These are words that, like, when I read that this week, thinking about today, I was like, wow, he knew what he was doing. You know, sometimes, I don't know if it's in a movie or something where it's like, oh, it's kind of accidental. Like he didn't really mean to do that. Oh, no, not the way it reads. He looked this way and that. Like, well, nobody's around. Struck down that Egyptian and hid him in the sand, which I guess there's plenty of near whatever was going on. And so he left. He escaped to Midian because Pharaoh was, he was on trial at that point, and Pharaoh was going to execute his punishment. He escaped the punishment, but not his past. He's living in a place that was not among his people, that was not either of his people, honestly. He wasn't among the people of Israel. He's no longer among Pharaoh's daughter's family and all that. He's out in Midian, like tending sheep. Here's a guy that was, well, if you like the Disney movie, the Prince of Egypt, right? And he's tending sheep out there. And he got married. He had a couple of kids. Years have passed, so Midian had become a home. But Moses seems comfortable, right? A bit. He gotten comfortable in a place where maybe you shouldn't have settled, where you shouldn't have been, where you shouldn't have gotten to in the first place. God showed up for Moses and chose him, and God chooses us as well according to his will. Because we all have a past, don't we? Now, maybe we haven't looked this way and that and struck someone down and buried them in the sand, but we probably have looked this way and that, and seeing that, well, no one was watching, done things that we knew we shouldn't have done. Done things we knew we could maybe get away with, but carried around guilt, maybe for years. But this is what Ephesians chapter 1 tells us. For he chose us in him. God chose us in Jesus before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him. Not that we should be holy, like, oh, you should be holy, but you're not. No, that we will become, by his grace, holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will. He chose for his purposes, for his reasons, and he gives us the gift of grace. Why? I don't know. Because Moses sure didn't deserve his grace, looking this way and that and burying the guy in the sand. And I don't deserve his grace because I've looked this way and that and, well, tried to bury my past. But we bury those things in sand, and the wind comes along and blows it away, and our past just keeps coming back to us, doesn't it? But God doesn't see that. God doesn't see your past buried in the sand. God sees you as his precious child, and according to his will, he gives you the grace of God in Jesus because he chose you in him before the foundation of the world, before you had a chance to blow it, before we were even born. We were chosen. Some people might seem like obvious choices, right? Oh, that's a holy person. I remember when I was a kid thinking the pastor that I had, his name was Lyle Rosh. And as far as I was concerned as a young kid, he was a holy man. Like, he was perfect. Like, there was nothing that Lyle Rosh did, in my mind, that would have separated him from God. And that's who you have to be if you're going to be a pastor. So when I was a little kid, I thought there is absolutely no way I can do that job. Here I am. You know what I found out? Two things. One, Lyle Rosh was not perfect. And I didn't learn that because I've, discovered something. I learned that because he told me so. And because the Bible tells us that none of us is perfect. And I learned that no pastor is perfect. I'm not. And no pastor I've ever known, including Lyle Rosh, has been a perfect and holy person, but God has chosen pastors. But not just pastors. God chooses everyone of his people for his purposes, according to his will. And we're called his friends. John chapter 15 in the gospel reading for today. This is the vine and the branches section of John 15, where I am the vine, you are the branches, remain in me. And God says, or Jesus says this in verse 15, no longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. This is the same section where Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, that someone would lay down his life for his friends. And then tells us, I call you friends. Jesus laid down his life for us. And he's made that choice for us. He chose the cross for us. He chooses to give us grace and mercy. And the Exodus story that Moses is a big part of anticipates what Jesus will do. Because they're themes of rescue and redemption for God's people worked through Moses that we see repeated in Jesus, the rescue and redemption of God's people through the cross. There's a lot of overlap between these stories. What's more is that God chose you for his purpose, according to his will and for his purpose. See, Moses was called to lead God's people out of Egypt. Verse 10, God speaking to Moses says this, come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Moses is like, what? Maybe you have me confused with somebody else. His first question actually is this, who am I? Who am I that I should go do that? Maybe you've second-guessed your purpose, your calling, your place in the world. Moses did too. You're in good company. Then he asks this question, well, who do I say sent me? Because if I just show up after I've been gone for this long and I say, oh, by the way, I'm here to do this, people are going to think, this guy was out in the wilderness too long, talking to sheep. Who do I say sent me? And then in chapter 4, what if they don't believe me? And that's when God tells Moses, well, there'll be signs. And finally, this is in chapter 4, at verse 10. Well, two more, actually. I'm not so good with words. This is Moses like, wait, you're going to send me to Pharaoh to say, let my people go? I'm going to stumble over just that expression. And finally, verse 13, Lord, please send someone else. God identified Moses as the person he chose for his purpose. And Moses is like, wait, I can't. But you know what happens? It's not the can'ts of Moses or of us that's important. It's what God plans. And God knows what's going to happen. The end of chapter 3, and again, these words kind of jumped off the page to me this week as I was reading this story. God tells Moses, here's things that are going to happen. Pharaoh's heart is going to be hardened. There's going to be plagues. And when you leave, you're going to plunder Egypt. All of that took place. God already knew how it was going to work and how it was going to go down and what was going to happen before Moses even left Midian to go back. You and I are chosen to bear fruit. Not to go to Egypt where people are enslaved and rescue, but to bear fruit in our lives. John 15, verse 16. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit and that your fruit should abide. What does God have in mind for us? To bear fruit. To love one another, which it also says in John 15. Yes, and to bring freedom and redemption to God's people. Not in the same ways that Moses did, but with the message that Jesus gives us, that his grace is for all. What if they don't believe us? That's not our concern. What about our objections? I have a past. Maybe I'm not good with words. Maybe I got too much going on. Maybe I'm too busy. Maybe I'm just, please send someone else. Jesus gives us a job to do, to go and bear fruit, to love one another, to be people who follow him, and to live it out. Because what matters more than our objections is the one who sends us, and the one who knows what's going to happen, and the one who chose us in him to bear fruit. You are a chosen child of God from the billions living now. And from the billions who've ever lived, God has chosen you. He has called you by name. He's redeemed you through his gift of grace and given you a purpose in life, a unique set of skills and gifts and opportunities, a unique time and place where he knows you are going to be, and the opportunity to share his word of grace through your life. Chosen children of God. That is who you are. That's who I am.